Please turn in it to Romans 8, the 8th chapter. We're back in that same chapter again, which the lectionary just takes us there, so here we go. When we study the Bible relative to salvation, one aspect of that study comes about in the form of the study of the law, the Jewish law. And the Jewish law, I think we all have a general idea of what we're talking about. We're talking about, one, you've got the ceremonial law where the Jews had all of their worship practices outlined for them, how the temple was going to be, how big things were going to be, how the ark was going to be handled, all of that, how the priests' practices would be, what would the priests wear. Those are all ceremonial laws. And then you've got the civil law, which is no longer in force. This is the law that explained to them how they would, say for instance, orchestrate their lives with their servants. What would you do? How would you handle the servant? What would happen if someone committed a crime? How would the punishments be? That's the civil law. And for the most part, that civil law in the Jewish law itself is no longer in effect. But then there's the moral law, which is the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. And those are for all time, forever. And we still are obedient to them. But the law has a purpose beyond the Jewish history and beyond its function as a way to constrain us. I love what Alan Dershowitz, the lawyer, said. He said, were it not for the Ten Commandments, we would not have jurisprudence in this country. I thought, wow, that's pretty significant for a legal scholar like that to say something like that, especially a Jewish one. But the law has another purpose. Its purpose is to stir up within us the idea that we have done wrong before a God who is absolutely right, no matter what we think. So let's take a look at this text that speaks to that and also speaks to something else regarding the law, which is that law of adoption. In verse 12 of chapter 8, Paul says, "So then, brothers and sisters, we're under an obligation, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit we put to death the deeds of the body, we will live. For all who are led by the Spirit are the children of God. You did not receive the spirit of slavery again to fear, but we received the spirit of adoption by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit Himself bears witness to our spirit that we are God's children. And if we're children, then we're heirs, namely heirs and also fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with Him, that we may also be glorified with Him. For I consider our present sufferings cannot even be compared to the glory that will be revealed to us. For the creation itself eagerly awaits the revelation of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of God who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself will also be set free from the bondage of decay into the glorious freedom of God's children. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers together until now. Not only this, but we ourselves, who also have the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly as we eagerly await our adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope. But because who hopes for what they see? But if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with endurance." Now this text contains a lot of theology that we're not going to be able to get into this morning in a singular sermon. But I want to focus upon the idea of adoption. It means a lot, and it's very significant that Paul would write this. It's not really a metaphor. Adoption was something that really took place, but use it as an illustration to describe what happens for you and for me as we come into God's family through being born again because of what Jesus accomplished on the cross. There's a term, and it's very significant that he would write it to the Roman church because of their system of adoption. These people who would receive this letter would understand this in a way that most churches would not, because they're not acquainted necessarily with this Roman system in such a strict way. In the Roman system, you had a term that was called patria potestas. Patria potestas. What it meant was the father is the ruler, absolute ruler. In a Roman home, the father didn't just make decisions like what the carpet would look like or how big the kitchen would be. The father made every decision, and all of those decisions carried as far as even life and death for the children that were born into the family. If a father decided that a child was one child too many to feed, then you have an explanation as to why there would be children found exposed along the Appian Way crying in the woods because they had been put out. Or the father could decide to kill the child outright. And there was nothing that was wrong with that in the sight of the Roman understanding of what was legal. So the father had absolute control over the family. And relative to the sons, this is significant. It's a patristic system. So relative to the sons in the family, the son never outgrew being the father's possession. They were always possessed by the father as property. And so if a person was going to be adopted, especially a son, it was a really big deal. They would go in before a magistrate, and there was all this ceremony that went into it. There would be a copper scale set on the desk. I guess they had desks. And twice the birth father would place a weight on one side of the scale, and the magistrate would place another weight on the scale and tip it twice up, showing that the father was not buying back the child. And then the third time would show that this ownership of this boy was going to the new adoptive father. That was the symbolic relationship to the scale. Once that relationship was surrendered by those three tips of the scale, the adoptive father would then make his plea to the praetor, that is the magistrate, for the son, the adoptive son. And the consequences were incredible for these boys. They lost all rights within the first family. Whatever their birth family was, the new adoptive family was the family they were going to, and whatever rights they had in the birth family, they lost. So, this happened. If a father was giving up a son for adoption because the son was wayward, and this father wanted to get this son into a family where this son would have to work or be changed in some way by the severity of the family that the father had arranged for this adoptive family to be, then the son would lose all the inheritance of the wealthy family and take on the inheritance of the poorer one. Now this happened. They gained all the rights of legal heir in the new family, whatever those rights were, and even if there were subsequent births in the adoptive family, the adoptive son still retained the rights of heirship. The old life was completely done away. All the debts that this son might have accrued in the birth family, whatever was following him at that point in his life, good or bad, was wiped away, and the life was started brand new. He was now legally the son of the new father, whatever that meant. Roman history, there's an example of this. Claudius, the emperor, took on Nero as an adopted son. Well, when Nero grew up in that family, he looked over at his adopted sister, who was not blood kin to him, Octavia, and thought, boy, she really looks nice. I'd like to marry her. But he couldn't, because he had been adopted into that family. And so Nero had to appeal to the Roman Senate to pass legislation just to make it possible for him to marry Octavia. That's how seriously they took the adoptive laws in Rome. And you had to have 7 witnesses present at this ceremony, so that then if there were any disputes relative to the inheritances, those disputes could be settled by saying, we were all here, we saw, and we heard, and we know what all of this means. So it was a serious thing. Now Paul uses this to describe what's happened to us, that we've been adopted into God's family. Think about it. Think about it in terms of the Roman system for just a minute. All right, once sin was our father. We were possessed by sin, literally. God, through a legal payment, through a ceremony by which we became born again, by which Jesus died on the cross for our sins, He legally adopted us. In the eyes of God, we've been legally adopted. The Holy Spirit is a witness. Jesus is our advocate. So you've got the witnesses there present. And the old life has no bearing over us at all. It's gone. God now has absolute rights to us as the adoptive father. And the past, our past, with all the debts of sin that we had, it's been canceled out and wiped away. It's gone forever. We become then inheritors, just like this text had said, of Jesus' inheritance. But that inheritance also includes Jesus' suffering. Not just the inheritance of the good stuff, but also the suffering. We become a member of God's family. And we didn't deserve it. God just wanted to adopt us, and mercy made the way. And then Paul closes this, and I love what he does here. He says it gives us the spirit that cries out, Abba. Now, this is extremely significant because this is not a term of significance in the sense of being formal. It's the kind of word, think about it in us when we raise little children. This is not a heartwarming term of appeal here, Abba. It's the kind of thing a toddler would say relative to dad. We say dad or dada or daddy or papa or pop. We have all those terms of endearment, but if you think about those terms, Abba, Dada, those terms are like in Sweden, Da, Pa and Fa for mom and Pa. I mean, all those terms, they're kinds of things that a toddler can easily say. They're the kinds of things that a toddler can pronounce without any great effort. You don't have to have a lot of linguistic skills to say Abba. And so the whole picture here that we're being given is one of becoming like a plaintive child. This is not a sophisticated thing. This is something, the plaintive cry of a child toward the parent. Now, Paul also says you and I and the whole universe are groaning. And we looked at groaning a week ago relative to our prayer. That there are things which we groan inwardly that the Spirit expresses to God that we don't understand. But this is a different groaning. This is saying that the whole cosmos and we within it, being part of it, are all groaning about something. What are we groaning about? We're groaning about the fact that the whole universe has been, as Paul says, subjected to futility. And I'll tell you, this picture, for me at least, is a huge comfort in this world. Because it explains a lot. It explains the evil and the suffering that I see that looks, if you don't have any connection to this, what's known as theodicy, that is plugging God's goodness together with the suffering in the world, if we don't have that connection, it just looks gratuitous. It looks like that's just the way the world is, so what? Things happen, the bumper sticker. And so, but this tells me that the reason that we look at it and we think of it as wrong or gratuitous is because it is wrong. It's not the way God intended it to be ever. I remember a friend of mine coming to me, and he lost his wife. And he said to me, "Why did God take my wife?" And I explained it on the basis of this groaning, that God didn't take his wife. She died because things are not the way they're supposed to be. That was never intended for her to have that disease that took her life. It's never intended a funeral should take place. We go to a funeral. I use this at funerals every time. That there's something wrong with this person being in this coffin. And there is. It's an intuition we have, but it's the right intuition. It's a remembering almost of the fact that the world is not the way it's supposed to be, and that this suffering that's taking place is not what was intended ever. That's why we feel like anytime something happens like this, disease or death, that there's something wrong with it. There is something wrong. And this brings a significance to living, at least for me, that helps to push some of that pain aside, because I get a new perspective on what it means to live in this world with the suffering that's in it. I think about things like this, how we do this because we recognize that something is wrong, but we cling so tenaciously to our own life and to the life of someone we love. We cling to them because we recognize that something is wrong with losing them. in this world. Something's wrong with that. The degree to which we recognize the truth that Paul is giving us here in this text will be, I would say, absolutely the degree of comfort we're going to find when those moments come. And they are going to come for all of us. Right? We're all going to come to a place where things look gratuitously bad. And we're going to say, why? The why is because the universe is not the way God intended it to be. That sounds so clinical and it sounds so theologically precise, but I got to say, for me, it brings me enormous comfort to know that God's character is different from the way things look down here. That means a lot to me. And another thing about it that gives me a lot of comfort is we've all known people who've been caught in that idea of, why did God do this to me? Some of them are believers. Why did God take this person from me? Why did this have to happen? What I love about this text is it tells me that I don't have to get that right in order to find the comfort. That even if I'm wrong in the way I'm thinking about God and the suffering in my own life, the comfort will still come because God knows what the truth really is. I don't have to get it right. Now, God used the Jews throughout their history to bring this teaching to us. This is what Paul's referring to here regarding the law. And it was a costly teaching. It took all of their history, 1,500 years, to bring it to where the cross begins to explain what all of that was relative to the Jewish history. But the Jews had the right picture all along. They had two worlds that they thought of. There was the world now in which we live, with all of its suffering and trial and difficulty. And then there was the world God's going to bring in, the new world. That's why Isaiah says in Isaiah 65 and Isaiah 11, a lion will lay with a lamb, not being digested, but laying down next to it. A child will play at a cobra's den. He says, he closes that text by saying, and nothing shall do any harm in all of my holy mountain. That there's going to be a restoration of everything. Everything will be put back right. Nature itself is messed up. And isn't it interesting that nature had no choice in that matter whatsoever? We did. We said no to God. We said, this whole obedience thing doesn't look like something I want to do. And so God said, okay, I'll give you what you want. You want to be free from me as God? Fine. Then you can have the whole world just like it would be if I weren't superintending it. And that's what He gave us. The rocks and the trees and the fish and the stars and everything else, they had no choice in that. They are victims. That's why Paul says the whole creation has been subject to futility. Did you know, you probably know this, but science tells us, that if time continues to go as it is, that the universe will suffer what's called a heat death. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily hot. It can mean cold just as well. Everything tends toward entropy. If you set a coffee cup at 175 degrees in the middle of this room and you leave it there long enough, what little heat can escape into the room will raise the temperature of the room. The coffee cup will assume room temperature. If you leave it there for 10 billion years, it'll become ultimately cold. All the heat energy will be lost. Or some tell us that the universe will just burn up. It'll recollapse into a hot fireball and everything will be incinerated. Either way, the universe is totally futile. It has no meaning at all in that picture. It's going to go away. It's like the picture, my favorite picture, and I made it up myself. Thought it was a pretty good one. A bunch of tadpoles in a puddle on the street in the spring. The frog has found a body of water and it lays its eggs, and the tadpoles hatch. And you go past a puddle. I used to go by them all the time as a kid and look down there and see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these little black toad tadpoles in the water. The water looked like it was boiling. There were so many of them in there. Come back there 2 days later, the puddle's about this deep, and now they're struggling to swim. You come back 3 days later and they're all dead. Their whole universe was futile. It's got no meaning. They were born into it, but their lives are over along with the universe they lived in. That's the picture of the universe we're given. unless the universe is being superintended by a God who cares about what happens to you and me. That's the picture Paul gives here. That's the picture the Jews had. God would restore everything. Let me quote somebody you may not have ever read before. You may have. I like him as an author, but he was not a believer. H.G. Wells says this relative to what humanity's ultimate destiny is. And if there's no God, he's right. Humanity, who began in a cave behind a windbreak, will end in the disease-soaked ruins of a slum. I think that's right. I think that's right for the whole universe. It's just going to be gone, and everything that humanity ever was, said, wrote, accomplished, thought will be gone with it. Unless there's a superintendent for the universe that cares about what happens to you and to me. So, are we just to return to potting soil? Does that seem like a good outcome? Some think so. I don't think so at all. Why do you think Jesus in the garden, prior to the cross, addresses God as Abba? Abba. And he also used that term to teach us about prayer. Abba. The toddler's cry toward the Father. I think it's clear. He's telling us that Abba will provide the grace we need in the moment we need it. The cry Abba is not some sophisticated, reasoned deliberation about God's essence and his theology conceptually. It's not any of that. It's the cry of a child who has no pretense of self-sufficiency whatsoever. That's why he told us that. Abba will take us to the place of safety ultimately, and we can be confident in that. We can have that. That's real hope. I don't know where everybody is today.